Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through the 10 greatest jazz saxophone players in history, which means basically we're going through the 10 greatest saxophone players. I can't think of anyone outside the realm of jazz that would make this list. So what we have here is not only the 10 greatest saxophonists of all time, but as the saxophone was for the middle part of the 20th century, was perhaps the most important culturally defining instrument of that time, taking over from the trumpets in jazz, probably with the advent of the saxophonist Coleman Hawkins, who was the first person to really improvise on saxophone and create a reasonable language that you could, to expand the language of the saxophone. He wasn't the first to do it, but of course he will be on this list, but where? You'll have to find out. So I'm going to go through the list now, starting from 10 to 1. It is, of course, my opinion. There will be glaring omissions. I've tossed and turned over this over the last few days, trying to get this right. I wanted to have at least a couple of players that are still alive and that have recorded in the last 20 or 30 years, and not just be a whole host of classic jazz saxophonists. Shall we kick off? Right, so at number 10, I have Sonny Rollins. Sonny Rollins is a saxophonist that emerged in the late part of the bebop period in the 1940s, going on to make a series of albums throughout the 1950s, including things like Saxophone Colossus, where he explored that area between hard bop and bebop, and became very quickly known as being one of the great improvisers on that instrument. At the end of the 50s, he decided to go away and do some woodshedding, and quite famously, he would turn up at a bridge, I think in New York, I'm not too sure, and he would play in the night into the wind, looking for a new sound, a new approach, honing his skills as an improviser, trying to get to the truth, whatever jazz musicians do when they go out into the wilderness, in search of their soul. He returns in the 1960s, records the album The Bridge, which is my favourite Sonny Rollins album. I'm not a huge follower of Sonny Rollins. He is an interesting player, and that he takes the language of bebop and he basically becomes, I suppose, the great exponent of a way of playing jazz which is neither conservative or avant-garde. He is just an incredible improviser, and it's improvisation I feel he deals with when you listen to him play. Right, so being born in 1930, he is still alive. So this is the greatest improviser, jazz musician, whatever, on the planet. This is a very treasured human being. His improvisation skills are absolutely legendary. He had a hard tone, he was driving, his sense of invention was almost limitless. And I think the best way to sum up Sonny Rollins is with the story that is told in Ken Burns' jazz documentary. So I will retell that here. A jazz critic went to see Sonny Rollins play, and it was the Saturday before Easter Sunday. And he's playing all night, as Sonny Rollins does, and he's in this long solo, and he seems to be lost. His eyes are closed, and he's lost in this realm of improvisation. And then suddenly, in amongst all this stuff that's going on, he quotes. Now, a quote is where a jazz musician will play another tune and embed it inside the improvisation. It's a very difficult thing to do because you're following the chord progression, so you have to pull a phrase out from another tune that will fit that chord progression. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. I think you could only really do it when you've studied and you are so ingrained in the chord progressions and the imperative to be able to pull material that it almost comes out of your subconscious or out of the ether. So he quotes, put on your Easter bonnet with all your frills upon it, right? Which is from the tune, I think it's called Easter Bonnet, right? And this critic notices it because he knows what he's listening for. And he goes, oh, that's funny. Then he looks at his watch and he realizes the clock has just struck midnight and it is now Easter Sunday. So within all the stuff that was going along, he'd obviously looked up, seen that it was about to become midnight, which means Easter Sunday would start. And what do you do on an Easter Sunday? You put on your Easter bonnet with all your frills upon it. This might give you an idea of the level that advanced jazz musicians are working at. Jazz is an incredibly sophisticated form, drawing on all sorts of different techniques, approaches, music forms. Sonny Rollins was interested in that he was one of those jazz musicians from an age when he would state emphatically that jazz was not African music and was not an African-American music form, that it was an American music form. And in reading his thoughts on this when I was younger, I realized that his skill and ability is, I think, diminished by hemming jazz in any sort of racial or cultural or historic terms. This music goes beyond that. And so if you want to know where a lot of my contentious opinions first came from, it was first came from Sonny Rollins and reading his very intelligent and thoughtful thoughts on jazz. So go and check that out if you want. So that's who we've got. Number 10 is the great Sonny Rollins. Right, so at number 9, I have Steve Coleman. Now, I believe Steve Coleman was born around about 1956, right? So he came sort of to adulthood in the late 70s. At that time, there was the big jazz, rock and jazz fusion thing going on, but a lot of jazz musicians were returning to a more traditional or conservative way of playing jazz. And this is the world that Steve Coleman came into. Someone who had grown up in the world of jazz, who'd studied, Ornette Coleman, Coltrane, all that stuff, but had also come up through the fusion era as well. A little bit older than Wynton Marsalis. He sort of comes to, he comes, well, the first time I noticed him was with the Dave Holland Quintet, the incredible quintet that he put together that did out such albums as Extensions, incredible stuff. And on this, although this was an acoustic group, Dave Holland was exploring a sort of modal jazz with odd time signatures and a lot of rhythmical interplay as well as harmonic interplay. Dave Holland being the sort of unsung hero of that wave of musicians that emerged out of the Miles Davis group and out of that sort of jazz fusion brew, that you heard on albums like Bitches Brew. So he then starts to work with his own group. And what's interesting with Steve Coleman, who's a master improviser, is he doesn't just want to form a group. He wants to create a movement in jazz. And he comes up with a sort of collective, which he is the dominant leader, but there's a whole bunch of other musicians involved in this, called the M-Bass Collective. They recorded under that name sometimes. The M-Bass Collective, I think the idea was to explore and unite, I suppose you could say, Black American music forms, although I think that term's clunky, with more esoteric approaches to creativity, drawing on nature, drawing on ancient history, drawing on all the stuff I love, all that sort of esoteric Egyptian, numerology and all this type of stuff. And he comes up with almost like a new form of jazz in the 1980s. This is very much under the radar, and a lot of jazz fans aren't aware of M-Bass. When I first heard it, when I bought the album Black Science by Steve Coleman, I was blown away. And what it sounded like to me was a cross between Ornette Coleman and James Brown. That's what it sounds like. It's like Ornette Coleman's ideas, but put into a very funky rhythmical context. But it's not just the funk, because Steve Coleman has a certain approach to improvisation, which I see as being centred, that he improvises from a centre out. Now, Ornette Coleman had a similar idea. It's looking at yourself as being at the centre of the universe and everything is out. Ornette Coleman was a big fan of that architect that used to make the sort of buildings made out of septicons, whoever that was. You know, someone will put it in the comments. Anyway, and Steve Coleman has that approach. And so from this point, he would create harmonic structures that were numeric. So it means you would go up that amount, and if you went up that amount, you went down that amount, then that amount, and then. So he would build out like that, which is a very esoteric principle, as above, so below. And the same thing with the timings. He would have a lot of numeric timings that run against each other. I was once very lucky to be involved in a masterclass with Rich Brown, who was Steve Coleman's bass player for a while. And when I asked him about Steve Coleman, he said he's basically the John Coltrane of our generation, which I thought was a very perceptive comment. And he also said that his approach was to draw things from nature. So, for example, he said we were once in a rehearsal and he brought this composition in. And he said part of the band was in 22 and the other band was in 7, and they were playing against each other. Now, of course, if you divide 22 by 7, you come up with pi, which is an infinitely recurring number. And so by doing this, he is suggesting the realm of infinity, infinite possibilities. And I believe that all great jazz fundamentally is dealing with infinity or the void, or trying to unite the two. Steve Coleman has done that for the last 40 years and has become perhaps, I think, the most important saxophone player, probably the most important jazz musician to have emerged in the last 40 years. When you watch all these internet groups, and they do this sort of 16th note bass funky approach with lots of kicks and syncopations, this is a simplified version of what M-Bass did. It produced a whole raft of incredible players. I'm thinking like Marvin Smitty Smith on drums, Dave Gilmour on guitar, Cassandra Wilson on vocals, Gary Thomas on saxophone. A whole host of players came through this M-Bass movement. Very, very influential. So that's who I've got at number 9 on this list, is Steve Coleman. At number 8, we have Michael Brecker. Almost like the definitive saxophone sound of the 1970s. Brecker emerged in the late 60s, probably finding fame first off in the band The Dreams, and then he went on to form the Brecker Brothers with his brother Randy Brecker, and they became the great sort of funky jazz fusion group of the 70s. He also entered the session world and played on a host of really incredibly famous tunes. For example, James Taylor's How Sweet It Is. I think that's Brecker. Definitely Still Crazy After All the Years by Paul Simon. That's Brecker. An incredible musician, and a lot has been said about him. And when I put him on the list, I thought, I don't really know what to say about Brecker without just sounding like a cliche. So I did a little bit of research, and I'm going to come at this in another way. And this is going to be one of the main parts of this video. So this story might take a while to tell, but I am going to tell it anyway, because I think it gives an insight into what Michael Brecker was like. And what Michael Brecker was like was a quiet and introverted musician. That came from a very musical family, a very artistic family. And he had a brother that was 4 years older than him, who is also one of the greatest musicians in recent jazz history, the great Randy Brecker, who was born, I think, in 1945, Brecker being born in 1949. So Randy Brecker, genius trumpet player, one of the greatest, goes off to music college in the 60s. And Brecker, who looks up to his brother, wants to follow in his footsteps, you know. So it's very interesting that Michael Brecker was in the shadow of his brother, as most little brothers are. So he started to play and practice, and he was never very confident in his playing. And his big Achilles heel at that time was the fact that he couldn't really read music. He was not a great reader. Now, he must have done a lot of work to operate in the session world, and I do wonder how he got on with that. Anyway, before he joined his brother, the first commercial recording he did was with his brother in 1969, after he'd gone to music college. It was an album called Score. But before that, he had his own band, and this band contained a whole host of great musicians. And the thing with Brecker was, he is basically the product of a saxophone player listening to John Coltrane, and he was obsessed with Coltrane. He would sit and transcribe Coltrane solos all day long, but also rhythm and blues, soul and funk saxophone players, people like Maceo Parker, that type of player. And Brecker brings those two things together. And he starts to do this in a commercial band in the early 60s, which I wish I could remember the name of, which I can't. But it does not matter, because it doesn't bear any relevance to the story we're about to tell. They signed with a management company, and this management company dragged them over to Chicago to play a number of shows, okay? As they got pulled into the Chicago music scene, there was quite a lot of drugs going around at that point. And the band started indulging. It was the late 60s, so they were indulging in LSD. When the band arrived, the drummer had a little sister that started tagging along, and they all went to a party. Brecker was there, but for some reason, Brecker decided to leave. And he went for a walk. So he goes off, you know, probably the introverted, or perhaps a sense that things weren't going well, because the sister of this drummer was involved in some sort of love triangle between a couple of the musicians or people associated with the band. She takes some LSD. This sort of jealousy and rivalry emerges in the middle of all this. And this young girl jumps out of a window and ends up killing herself. The police get involved, and the band are pulled in. They're pulled into the police. There's this idea that they might be charged with murder. There's a whole investigation, and Brecker, very sensitive young man, evades this because he wasn't there at the time. Although the stress that must have been under him at this point is incredible. A lot of great musicians, I believe, are born out of some sort of traumatic event, which, you know, they may be super talented, but the real fire and bite comes out of the trauma. And this is what I've said about jazz. You know, jazz is created by all sorts of different people. It's a product of integration, all different music forms. But the X factor is the collective trauma of the African American population. That is the thing that I think is so important. I think it almost deserves its own video to explain what's going on there, I do think. Anyway, so Brecker, he's very traumatized by this. Their drummer, who's obviously lost his sister and been involved in this terrible situation, a few years later also kills himself. A lot of the other band members stop playing, but Brecker goes on into the music industry, records with his brother, joins the band Dreams. Now, what's interesting with Dreams is they are one of these sort of late 60s brass-heavy early fusion bands like Chicago, Blood, Sweat and Tears. And what's really interesting is that they've got Billy Cobb on drums. Miles Davis goes to see the band. He's impressed with Billy, and he drags Billy in to play on Jack Johnson with John McLaughlin and all that. And that instant is like what kickstarts fusion. So he's right in the center of this situation that kickstarts jazz fusion. He starts to get involved in all sorts of things. When Billy Cobham leaves the Mahavishnu Orchestra, he pulls together basically Dreams again, bringing in Randy Brecker and Michael Brecker, making those three incredible albums, Crosswinds, Total Eclipse, Shabazz, Funky Side of Things 4. Well, there's a live album in there as well. And out of that, he is able to form his own brand, the Brecker Brothers, which have great success. He makes a lot of money. He's very successful. But the thing that people don't realise is that at that point, throughout the 70s, Brecker spiraled into real serious drug abuse, eventually becoming a heroin addict. Now, I've said all this because Brecker has the aura of being this sort of really cool session guy. He's really got his act together. But he didn't. he didn't seem to have his act together till he got to the 1980s. He got married, and then he embraced married life with his kids, and it was all wonderful until he got to my age, 57, and died of cancer. A cancer that was quite rare. I can remember in 2005 doing a tour with Kenny Aranoff, and Kenny had sent a sample off to look at his sort of bone marrow, I think, to see if he could be a donor for Michael Brecker. And it's such a shame. He seems like such a beautiful, sensitive musician whose incredible ability was built on an insecurity. And I believe that the difficulties of trying to deal with the music business as he did wore heavy on him. He is not seen as a tragic figure in the same way John Coltrane is or Charlie Parker. But there is a tragedy there. And I wanted to discuss that because I think the next time you hear Brecker and you listen to the emotional impact of his playing, which is quite, transformative. It was for me when I was very young and first heard the Crosswinds albums and heard his saxophone solo on Heather, where he sort of seems to emerge out of the mist of some Scottish landscape with the heaviest, funkiest, Coltrane-esque saxophone playing you've ever heard. That great big, thick, lovely tone, and every single phrase just wrought in stone. What an incredible player Brecker was. So that's who I've got at number 8 was Michael Brecker, and I hope that story is, sort of illustrated a different side to him, because I don't know how many people know about that aspect of this master musician. Anyway, at number 7, I've got a musician that goes right back to the beginnings of jazz, the great Sidney Bechet. Right, so Sidney Bechet was a Creole musician who was born in 1897. That's 4 years before Louis Armstrong was born. He's one of the first great musicians of jazz, and he's perhaps the first virtuoso to emerge in jazz. Jazz in the early days was a bit of a novelty music form. It was a bit of a party music form. It was a lot of, jumping around and having marches and going to parties and staying in parts. And it's sort of, it was like groovy marching music, really. The way it gets turned into an art form is it's too detailed to explain here in any way, but I am working on a video of that. But I would place Sidney Bechet as being the centre of that. Sidney Bechet started off on clarinet, which was the instrument of jazz up until, I would say, the late 20s, 1930s. But obviously to get a little bit of volume, he transfers over to the rarer instruments, the soprano saxophone. And when he emerges playing soprano saxophone, he really is the only major soprano sax player until the emergence of Coltrane, and when he uses it on My Favourite Things, which is very interesting. So he's almost playing this instrument. This is a weird instrument. And you've got to remember, there's no saxophone players at this point in jazz. Sidney Bechet is the first saxophone player in jazz, pretty much. And he's playing one of the weirdest instruments, the soprano saxophone. He was taught by the Tio family. Lorenzo Tio is a clarinetist that emerged from that family a little bit before Sidney Bechet. He was a little bit older, and I think he gave him lessons. Now, what's really interesting to me here, and it's something I've harped on about, and I get in trouble for this, but I think it's key to understanding jazz. Jazz is birthed out of integration, but it's integration at a time where the racial divides were strict but strange. In the 1890s, early 1900s, after the bringing in the Jim Crow laws that came in 1897, it was the luck of the draw with whether you got classified as black or white. You basically, I think if you were 1/8 black, then you were classified as black. So somebody like Lorenzo Tio, who was a sort of Creole Sicilian, was classed as white. Sidney Bechet, who was also Creole, would have been classed as black. But when you read interviews with Sidney Bechet, although he was completely aware of the sort of African heritage in his family, he saw himself as a French person. So you've got sort of French symphonic ideas coming through. Through Lorenzo Tio gave Bechet lessons, you get sort of Sicilian clarinet technique. I mean, the Tio family were great technicians and had come from they had a music school in New Orleans. Now, the Sicilian fingering is different to normal classical fingering and enabled these clarinet players to improvise in a way that you couldn't with the other technique. I wish I knew more about clarinet technique to explain what that is, but that is what I have read. And this is what turns Bechet into an absolute genius improviser, as well as the fact that he was a genius. His soloing approach is so exciting that even if you find early jazz difficult, I would suggest that Bechet is a great place to start. He's such an inventive improviser. He's so strong and powerful. And in an age where a lot of the early Dixieland jazz groups didn't have these strong improvisers, I think him and Louis, you can really hear the difference when you hear them play. He's got an incredible vibrato, very, very fast and wide and quite staccato. And with a soprano sax, it seems to suggest North African music to me. And so when you listen to it, there's a stew of Spanish influences, Sicilian influences, French influences, the blues, obviously ragtime, and all those things there. And because Bechet is the first great improviser, I mean, and he was like a prodigy as well. He emerged 1897. I think he's playing by 1912. So he's like, what's that, 15, 16, 17? He sort of emerges this incredible player. I think his importance to jazz cannot be overestimated. And I felt bad putting him at number 7 on this list. There's a very strong argument that you could put him very near the top. But I think these other players, unless we're going to focus totally on early jazz and say, well, that's the most important because there's where everything started. I didn't want to do that here. I wanted to give a wide idea. So I am now going to move on to number 6. But that's the great Sidney Bechet. At number 6, I've got Wayne Shorter. Wayne Shorter was born in 1933. He is, so he's 3 years younger than Sonny Rollins. He misses a little bit the true bebop era, sort of emerging in, I think he starts in Art Blakey's band, which is the late 50s. He sort of joins that band. Art Blakey's Jazz Messages at that time is almost like a training ground for new talent. And before long, Wayne Shorter is spotted as being one of the great young saxophone players, along with people like, Coltrane and Sonny Rollins. He's in that period of players. Miles Davis, who had Coltrane in his band in the late 50s, loses Coltrane, and he searches around for another saxophone player equal to Coltrane. He brings George Coleman in for a certain while, but eventually he grabs Wayne Shorter and he brings Wayne Shorter into his quintet, creating what is one of the greatest quintets in jazz history, which is the quintet with Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, Tony Williams on drums, and Wayne Shorter on saxophone. Wayne Shorter's approach can be seen as sort of running alongside Coltrane's, but where Coltrane was sort of using density, the sort of sheets of sound, almost like trying to embody all harmony. Wayne Shorter has a very similar approach, but it's much more introvert and it uses space. And the way Wayne Shorter gets into this expanded world of the infinite, remember I said this is so important in jazz improvisation, is through his compositions. His compositions are like, they're like harmonic Swiss clocks, and you enter into them and you expand out of them. And I think his compositions had a huge influence, say, on people like Herbie Hancock, who were younger and working at that band at that time. Miles Davis spots this, and it's quite strange because those 60s albums, he's basically just drawing upon Wayne Shorter's incredible compositions. He stays in Miles's band throughout the 60s. He also creates some incredible albums throughout the 60s, culminating, I would say, with Supernova, which is possibly Wayne Shorter's heaviest exploration into free jazz, and it's an incredible album with the dual guitars of Sonny Sharrock and John McLaughlin. When Joe Zawinul is drafted in, who is another, up-and-coming pianist that's been playing in the Cannonball Adderley Band, when he's drafted in to some of the album recordings with Miles, most notably In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew, there's a rapport between Zawinul and Shorter that is very, very strong, and they decide to form a band together with Miroslav Vitous, which is, of course, Weather Report, and they start to explore that sort of Wayne Shorter's compositional sound combined with Zawinul, who is also one of the great composers of in jazz of that period. Weather Report starts us as quite an esoteric sort of electric jazz group, but as the decade progresses, this actually, and it's quite surprising, becomes one of the most commercial fusion groups in history. You all know this. Wayne Shorter's sound, which is coming straight out of jazz history, straight out of free jazz, avant-garde jazz, becomes the sound of electric jazz fusion. If you go to AI and you put in, electric jazz Latin fusion, there will be a saxophone sound on there, and it'll be Wayne Shorter's saxophone sound, which was iconic on tenor sax, and it was iconic on soprano sax. As the 70s carry on, you see his role as a composer and active part of Weather Report diminishing, and I think he gets fed up with it by the mid-80s. And he starts on his own solo career that carried on up until his death quite recently, I think a couple of years ago, where he died, in his 90s. I think he was about 90 years old when he died. And he was a very powerful musician right up until the end. His final group, which was really exploring sort of instant improvisations, almost as instant composition, was a pretty incredible group that rewrote the rules of jazz, and actually caused a bit of a storm when some idiot, I can't remember who it was, came out and said that Wayne Shorter couldn't play. Do you remember that load of nonsense that's happened? Because his style, even though he was in his 80s and 90s, his style, which had come out of free jazz and avant-garde jazz, stuck in the throat of these ideological robots that have been told that the most important thing in jazz is to play through the changes and cop Charlie Parker licks. That, awful conservatism that now exists in jazz. Wayne Shorter was still pushing the boundaries of that, when he was a very, very old man. One of the great musicians of the 20th century, without a doubt. There's an incredible documentary out there of him, and it's a long documentary, and it really explores his not only his unique artistic achievements, but all the horrendous things that happened to him. Having very disabled children and trying to deal that while being out on the road, and then getting half your family wiped out in a sort of a plane, a jumbo jet crash, and continually just hitting these terrible things, which he deals with by retreating into Buddhism and accepting the way things is, and he becomes an enlightened being. When you watch that video, he is an enlightened being. It's a phrase, I think I got it from Robert Vasquez, and I love it. And that's the highest thing an artist can achieve, is to try and become an enlightened being. And there's a simplicity and childlikeness to these people because of the wisdom that they contain. And Shorter was definitely that, as was, I believe, the saxophone player I have at number 5, the legendary but still controversial Ornette Coleman. Ornette Coleman in the late 50s changes jazz forever, all right? The sort of, there's an elitism that is created in the bebop movement in the 40s. Those musicians are like punks, but they're trying to move away from the sort of, party music of the swing era by creating a music form that's so dense and intricate that you have to study it and listen to it seriously. It's all about, look at us, that we're very serious and this is an art form. That's what bebop does. And I think a lot of the musicians that emerge out of the bebop movement realise this is a bit of a straitjacket. The changes become a straitjacket, and the language that Charlie Parker, in the way he played saxophone has become a straitjacket. And so musicians start to push against it. You can see Miles Davis tries to calm it all down with the Birth of the Cool stuff. The hard boppers try and bring in a little bit of rhythm and blues, a little bit of groove, you hear that jazz messages. Ornette Coleman takes the bull by the horns. At this point, a lot of musicians are trying to say, how can we get away from the tyranny of the chord changes? How can I just express myself? And this is aligned to the civil rights movements that's happening in America, where black people are saying we want to be able to express ourselves, we want to be able to say what we want to say, we want to be able to create our own language, not be reliant on this language as cultural language that's been foisted upon us. And musicians are trying to do that. Coltrane's trying to do it by bust open the harmony from within. Ornette Coleman comes at it from a completely different way, which I think is related to his personality. Ornette Coleman seems to have been a very, almost like born in this sort of childlike way about him. I always picture him dressed in a court jester's outfit. He always seems to be about fun in a strange sort of way. Ornette's not a heavy musician. His compositions often sound like, nursery rhymes or games, and they are literally games you will play. His approach, and that's not true of The Shape of Jazz to Come and those early albums in the 1950s. His compositions like Lonely Woman have a mournfulness, which his later stuff doesn't have. What's Ornette Coleman's approach? Well, when I first heard him, I struggled with Ornette. His free jazz approach was very difficult for me, but I was also compelled by it. I didn't understand it, but I was compelled by it. And I started to listen to him a lot, and I started to read about him and try and get an angle on what he was trying to do. The thing that I got from it, and this is only what I got from it, and it's not doesn't mean this is what he would have said he was trying to do. And I have interviewed the great Calvin Weston, who was his drummer in the 1980s, and he's spoken about this, and that's one of my favourite interviews that I've done, because it really gets into the sort of genius of Ornette. The way I saw it is that the chord changes can be there, the arrangement can be there, but when you start to play, if you stop giving authority to the chord changes above everything else that's going on in the music, and start to actually respect the other things that are going on in the music. So what else is going on? Well, there's timbral, developments. There's rhythmical elements, which he sort of almost is more about motion, about the way you're going forward. And all these elements create, when you start to improvise, an impetus that is going in a certain way. And if you're a player and you're playing and you're going that when the chord change goes that way, you have to steer off that way. But you don't necessarily. You could just park comfortably for a while and then come back in. But that does not mean you don't play through the changes. But what it does mean is you give more weight to the music as a whole, and you start to see the motion of your improvisation as being the driving force. This he called harmolodics, which is harmony, motion, and melody all together. And I think melody is the key with Ornette, is that when you start to create a melody and improvise a melody, where does that want to go? And once the musicians are empathetic to this, they can bend and weave. The structure's still there. You're still playing the structure, but you are trying to, put your own voice into it. Now, when I did the interview with Calvin Weston, what was really apparent when he talked, the sort of training ground, because it was literally, he ran that band like a school. They had desks, and they had little beds, and they slept there. They got in the morning, and Ornette would teach them.
I even know how to talk like him. He said, what, Calvin, you want to come up and play for me? And I'm like, okay. And so I sat there behind the drum kit, and he just counted off 1, 2, 3, 4, and everybody in the room started playing. And I sat there, and I said, well, you know what? I can't just sit here and not do nothing, look at everybody. So I came in and I started playing swing, like a jazz swing. And out of everything that was going on, he heard me when I came in, and he stopped. And he looked at me and he said, "Calvin, this not jazz music. This not bebop. This not bebop jazz music." And I said, well, I don't know what to do. I mean, I just didn't know what to do. 17-year-old coming in out of the blue, bam, a freight train hitting me.
And who was in the band at this point?
It was Al McDowell, Jamal Dean, Charlie Ellaby, Burn Nix, Ornette Coleman, and of course Ornette. And so the rest of the rehearsal, I just sat there and listened. I didn't play again. So I said, Ornette, give me a week and let me come back up and play for you. He said, okay. So I went home and I said, well, what am I going to do? So this is what's crazy. And I tell people about it. I went home and I found every Mahavishnu record that I could find. And I had a little record player and I sat in my mom's living room, and day and night I listened to Mahavishnu Orchestra. I listened to the John McLaughlin licks, the Jerry Goodman, Phil, the Billy Cobhams. I listened to all of them because then that was so out to me, And I said, well, this is kind of out music. Meanwhile, Ornette had gave me like a list of his tunes. And I said, okay, so on this tune of Ornette's, I'm going to play Birds of Fire. Okay. On this tune, I'm going to play another Mahavishnu tune. I'm going to try to emulate it. So the next week when I got back to the rehearsal spot, Ornette would call a tune off, and I would look on my list and say, okay, this Birds of Fire. So when he count the tune off, I just started playing Birds of Fire, the best I knew how. I just started playing Birds of Fire. And Ornette stopped after about 2 minutes, and he said, oh, Calvin, that's good. That's good. That's good. That's good. And I'm like, what did I stumble onto? So all his tunes, then I had a tune of Mahavishnu Orchestra. Until, I was in the band for a while, and Ornette held his rehearsals like a classroom.
A new year means new possibilities. In 2025, go beyond what you thought possible.
We all had a desk, a school desk, mind you, and in a circle with Ornette in the middle, and we went over melodies, improving around melodies, and actually planned the melody to the song all the way through until I found out how to play around the melody of the tune that was playing and improvising around that, along with putting a groove into it and just playing the melody backwards, forwards, start in the middle of the melody, play the melody backwards, rhythmically. And he was satisfied with that.
Now, of course, Calvin was a member of Primetime, which was a fusion band which Ornette formed in the mid-70s. For me, this is his greatest achievement. I know the critics want to go back to the early 60s and listen to those proper jazz albums with Don Cherry and Charlie Haden, and they're brilliant and they are groundbreaking. But for me, his moving to jazz fusion and his focus on rhythm and that sort of funky James Brown sound, but he would often at this point have two bands and they're both playing in a James Brown way, but they sort of go their own ways and they come back. And a lot of the time, he's got certain people holding the groove down and certain people haven't. This approach was absolutely, it was a revelation for me. And I do tend to play, and can understand people criticising me, especially on guitar when I'm improvising, I will tend to just let go and just go, well, what is the shape I'm playing? Or where am I going with this? And just let it naturally go where it goes. And if I come out and come back in, then I come out and come back in. But if I lose my way, I've lost my way. And then I try, and sometimes I'll deliberately try and lose my way so that I can try and find my way back and see if that will create a way of playing, which is the cliche that you can rely on in the end. So that's Ornette. That is Ornette Coleman, number 5. Okay, one of the great saxophone players. At number 4, I have the Prez. I have Lester Young. Lester Young can be seen as possibly the Billie Holiday to Bessie Smith of the saxophone world. Now, Sidney Bechet, as we said, is the first saxophone player to emerge in jazz, and he's right there from the beginning. But he's not playing the standard saxophones that we know, alto saxophone and tenor saxophone. The musician that brings that in and basically turns the saxophone into the instrument of jazz is the saxophonist Coleman Hawkins. Now, as I weave through this list, it's probably easier to let you know that Coleman Hawkins is the next guy on the list at number 3. Lester Young is like if you see Coleman Hawkins as being the Bessie Smith, that big, strong, strident tone of Coleman Hawkins, this more playful and sweet and subdued sound of Billie Holiday is in Lester Young's playing. Now, the Billie Holiday, Lester Young link is much stronger than you think, as is the Coleman Hawkins, Bessie Smith. We'll get onto that in a minute when I get to him. Lester Young, it's so hard to get this across because the trouble with chatting with jazz history, you're often up against identity politics. And you have to understand where Coleman Hawkins is coming out from. Coleman Hawkins came to fame in Fletcher Henderson's group. Fletcher Henderson is the first great big band. It's the beginning of the Chicago style. What's the hell's the Chicago style? Well, the Chicago style was it was the follow-up to Dixieland jazz. And this is so important, the Chicago style. Before jazz has even sort of got on the march and is recording, these New Orleans musicians are up in Chicago. They're not in New Orleans, they're going to Chicago. They're going up north where the work is. They're even going across to New York. Within that, you have the Paul Whiteman group. You have people like Frank Tromber, Adrian Rollini. There's a whole bunch of players which are coming out of a much more sort of whiteified version of jazz, which gets maligned. We can't understand Lester Young unless we realise he was a huge fan of this jazz. He was a fan of a suite of jazz, and he's the guy that puts that onto the tenor saxophone. He himself did not, because he was a very introverted and quiet guy, but a visionary. So he really emerges in the 30s. He's like the sort of antithesis to Coleman Hawkins' big, brash, fruity sound. And he's got this very cool sound, much less vibrato. And this sound's going to influence. He's playing in a language that is going to become bebop, as is Coleman Hawkins. But he's also providing that sweet sound that's going to become the sound of cool jazz, West Coast jazz. We're going to hear it in the saxophone players like Stan Getz, like Paul Desmond, like Lee Konitz. It's a certain sound. He's a virtuoso. If you listen to those 30s recordings, he's an absolute virtuoso. He's part of the great Basie band, and Count Basie brings in Billie Holiday. He gets to know Billie Holiday, he plays her, and there's a relationship with them which is absolutely beautiful. But in the 1940s, he gets drafted into the army, and he is a very sensitive type, and I think he gets caught with some marijuana at some point, and he gets put into army prison. So he's a very sensitive black guy in army prison for about a year. and he comes under some very, very harsh treatment, and it traumatizes him. When he emerges out of that, he comes into sort of the bebop world that he's laid the groundworks of. And he develops this style, which is almost like a reaction to what happened to him. And it's all about, this secret language. If you think jazz has a secret language where they talk about cats and this is hot and this is cool and all these different names and the weird hats and all that things that we associate with Thelonious Monk and Dizzy Gillespie, Lester Young is the guy that invented all that as well. So his influence on culture is absolutely huge. The way he deals with the trauma of this army incarceration is through drink. And he starts to suffer with a whole bunch of drink problems in the early 50s. And his playing actually dips down. But I think around about 1956, he gets himself sorted out. And he gets pulled in to make a television documentary about jazz, which I think was called The Shape of Jazz. I think that's what it's called. And it was recorded in 1957. There was a whole host of famous people on there. Basie was on there, Thelonious Monk's on there. And they put together this supergroup, which has Billie Holiday, and they do this recording of Fine and Mellow. Now, I'm going to cut to a conversation I had with Martin Speake, the great British jazz musician, where we talk about this. So what we have here is, in my belief, is in that solo that Lester Young plays, in that incredible performance with those incredible musicians, is one of the greatest solos of all time. And it's not great because it's fast and virtuoso. It's great because Lester Young, in that sort of one chorus that he plays, or two choruses or whatever it is, he makes the most beautiful economic statement, which is a statement of love. When you watch it, you see the love between him and the music, and him and Billie Holiday. Like when I watch Billie Holiday on that 1957 show, and Lester Young comes up and says one of the best solo, probably the best solo ever,
best solo in jazz.
Yeah, that
and the connection with the two of them.
Yeah, and her face, the so love, good. And you go, that's actually what jazz is about. And to see Jerry Mulligan's utter respect for these musicians, and then Jerry Mulligan come in and go, this is the new thing now, and see people like Ben Webster nodding away, and see, it's not even about race, it's about age, it's about class. Everything diminishes, it all goes. It's a great moment. I'm glad you mentioned that. There's an incredible moment in music and they're all phenomenal, but that Lester Young solo,
oh god,
it's perfect, isn't it? It's just so perfect.
Yeah.
And the look on his eyes when he's playing is...
And it's slow.
It's
stunning.
And the thing is, it's like, I spoke to you yesterday. We've had this long conversation, and when we come down to it, that after all this big conversation, and we've tussled a little bit, which is really good because we've got different opinions. But then you and me are united. As soon as I sing that to you, you're going, oh, Andy, he gets it, and I know, and I'm going, oh, Martin, he gets it. How can both of us go that solo on the Billie Holiday is like one of the best solos in jazz ever?
Because
what are we talking about?
I'll tell you why. Because some things are universal. Some things are universal in the human experience, and you can't even put them into words. It just touches you. Not that every person in the world is going to relate to that, because perception is a big thing, and our upbringing and everything like that, But
I mean, look, here's the proof. I've got the little tears coming in my eyes of what you just said then about some things are universal, and what the universal thing is not some elite thing. It's love. When he got to his late 40s, a drink caught up with him, and he died, I think, in 59. On the way to the funeral, Billie turned round to whoever she was riding the car with and said, it'll be me next. And it was, and she died of alcoholism a few months later. And these people did not last long, but their influence on music and culture cannot be overestimated. So, of course, at number 3, I have Coleman Hawkins. Coleman Hawkins was born in 1904. It's 5 years before Lester Young. He was influenced by these saxophone players because the thing with the Paul Whiteman group, this was a lot more orchestral in its nature. So it had a much bigger section of musicians in there. So it had a saxophone section. The history of the saxophone is really, really interesting. Adolf Sax created this sort of alternative instrument, and he created a whole host of really strange instruments as well. You know, everything from the bass saxophone right up to the sopranino saxophone. But he also created great big organs and all sorts of like a saxophone tuba thing that you could wear. And he even tried to do all something. Very interesting bloke. He almost deserves a video. And so the Paul Whiteman and band, I think it's almost like seen as novelty. They had these saxophone, the novelty instruments, right? But in that, there's some incredible players. The two players I would identify would be Frank Tromba and Adrian Rollini. And Coleman Hawkins is a great fan of these people. And he starts to apply what they're doing onto tenor saxophone. And he has an incredibly developed harmonic sense. He's really using the chord tones and arpeggios to weave his way through these jazz standards or jazz tunes that he's playing. His first professional gig is in 1921 with Mamie Smith. Now, this is very interesting because if you look at Lester Young has this partnership with Billie Holiday, and they both have this sort of aesthetic. His first professional gig is with Mamie Smith. Now, Mamie Smith is the first person to record a blues in 1920. Okay, this is astonishing. With an all-black band, one of the first recordings, could well be the first recordings with a black band. And Mamie Smith had come out of this sort of Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, big, strong, deep, sound. And he has that on the saxophone as well. From there, he then joins Fletcher Henderson, and Fletcher Henderson is, as I said, one of the great early big band arrangements. And what Fletcher Henderson does, which is interesting, is rather than playing the sort of 2/4 rhythm of Dixieland, that sort of thing. He goes, it's a 4 feel. That's his great, thing. And when this kicks off and becomes the biggest form of music and really turns jazz into the big popular music form of the 1930s, and really is the beginnings of popular music, without a doubt, it's in there. Benny Goodman, who's the biggest, got the biggest big band in the world at the time, brings Fletcher Henderson in as an arranger. So this way of playing becomes very important. Coleman Hawkins is really interesting because unlike a lot of the early players that emerge in the 1920s, when the beboppers come along, because of his virtuosity, he's able to just jump in with them, which he does. In 1939, he plays a recording, which is actually an afterthought. He plays the tune Body and Soul, but he does not play the tune. He just comes straight in and does this sort of harmonic arpeggiated improvisation, which changes jazz. It's one of the most important recordings in the history of jazz. And I think his approach really lays the groundwork for bebop. When bebop's at its height in 1948, he then records a tune called Picasso, which is like an abstraction of this. And I feel when I listen to this, he's always pushing the envelope. In 48, Picasso is like the most advanced jazz piece around. It's up there with this, with a whole host of players that are pushing the envelope at that time. Again, I think he suffered with a drink problem. Didn't last that long. Last longer than Lester Young, and I think he died in 1969. But he plays on an album by Max Roach called I forgot what it's called. We Insist Now. The sort of civil rights album, and it's a work of genius, what Max Roach did with this. It's got Abby Link on vocals. It's famous for her doing that screaming. This is free jazz, and it's civil rights music jazz. This is the cutting edge in 1964 whenever Max Roach recorded. It's one of the greatest recordings. And on there's a tune called Driver Blues. I think it's called We Insist Now. That's what my sort of cruddy memories throwing up. But go and check out Driver Blues. It starts off with this sort of, it's the voice of the enslaved. Abbey Lincoln does it brilliant, and then the sort of slave master emerges, and this is sort of played in a way by Coleman Hawkins that comes in and plays in. It's just the most incredible playing. You hear him in '64, and you can hear where Albert Ayler and Archie Shepp, you can hear he's the embodiment of this. Every saxophone player has their sound rooted in Coleman Hawkins, and yet he was able to perform at the cutting edge of jazz right up until his death. I first heard him on the expanded recordings that Thelonious Monk made with John Coltrane. And I can remember hearing Coltrane, I was listening to Coltrane, and I wanted to hear what he was doing. And there was this incredible, powerful, harmonically advanced saxophone player. And I was looking at it thinking, well, this can't be Coleman Hawkins, because Coleman Hawkins is like an old saxophone player, isn't he? He's going to be playing like... And he wasn't. It was just... I cannot put into words how important these two saxophone players are, Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins. That is where saxophone playing comes from. So who have I got above them? Well, there's two players that just have to go at the top. And I think once I tell you who number two is, you'll know what number one is. So number two is John Coltrane. Born in 1926, sort of emerges in the music scene in the late 40s. He's not particularly a great player. He doesn't shine, but he gets a job playing in this sort of ensemble of Dizzy Gillespie's big band. As the 50s emerge, he starts to steadily walk, but he's on the long march, and he's pushing a certain approach, pushing his playing. He's an incredible practicer. There's stories of him sort of practicing continually all day long, 12 hours a day. He's practicing and he's pushing, and he's one of those players that's pushing the envelope. But the problem is with throughout the 50s is he's a heroin addict. Again, it would be interesting to get into the traumas and tribulations that cause this in Coltrane, but he does seem like a tortured soul. He eventually joins the Miles Davis group, where he does some very important recordings, but he gets sacked. I mean, that whole band was a bunch of drug addicts. Philly Joe Jones, Paul Chambers, Red Garland, I think Wynton Kelly, Coltrane. The whole group was heroin addicts. This had gone through the jazz world, but he gets sacked because of, I think, his drug addiction. Miles Davis had kicked his heroin habit around about 1954. So he then jumps out. He joins Thelonious Monk's band. This is a very important period in '57 when he does this. And at that time, he kicks drugs and has sort of a spiritual awakening. And I think he starts to see music as a path to enlightenment. Now, that had always been in jazz. It had always been there, but it had never been explicit. Coltrane's really great achievement, I believe, in music is to bring in this sort of spiritual element and to align music with a sort of ascendancy up to something that is greater than ourselves. I know that I was very influenced by Coltrane in that respect. How's Coltrane going to do this? Well, he's trying all sorts of methods. Some of it is modal, so you just stack the chord progressions and let's play on a scale. But his approach to modal soloing is to actually bring in parallel modes of scales and almost spin out a million different scales. It's very interesting how he does that. And the first time you really hear that is when he plays the tune My Favourite Things from The Sound of Music. which starts off with a vamp between two minor chords, placing it in the Dorian mode. And although he plays the tune and the band goes through the chords that go with the tune, when he hits that vamp, he then just stays on it and takes that Dorian mode and spins it out into all these realms. It's almost like 4-dimensional music. But the other way Coltrane did it was through his thing called the Coltrane Matrix, which was the idea of taking the 2-5-1 and then busting it into 3 dimensions. You know, so you've basically got, if you take all the notes, the 12 notes, and you arrange them in a cycle of fifths, right, around the clock. If you play a 2-5-1 here and then do a sort of triangle, you have another 2-5-1 here, equal distance here. So they're spread out. So these 2-5-1s are sort of covering 3 cadences which go through all the keys. If you can imagine that. Coltrane creates the tune Giant Steps and Countdown and a few other tunes at this time, and creates a way of taking the very harmonic structure of jazz, which is the 2-5-1, and busting it out into 3 dimensions. He is looking to ways to free the music. When the free jazz emerges in the 1960s, he embraces that as well. But he doesn't give up on the way he's playing. When you listen to Coltrane's version of free jazz, he is still using his matrix, and that matrix applies to scale a modal concept to try and reach out forward. It's quite incredible. His influence on jazz is inestimable. Oh, God. Coltrane. I've spoken about him so many times on this channel. And when you're chatting about these great musicians, it's like you sort of trot out the same stuff over and over again. You want to say something different about him. When I was a kid on BBC, they would often have these sort of music weeks on BBC Two, jazz and blues weeks, put loads of documentaries on, loads of videos of, you know, Alexis Corner interviewing B.B. King and gigs by Buddy Guy. I can remember watching all of these and just, lapping it all up. And at some point, they broadcast that 1959 TV broadcast of the Miles Davis Group with Jimmy Cobb, Paul Chambers, Coltrane, Miles, playing So What, very, very famous. But I'd never heard it before. My dad was a Miles Davis fan, so I watched it. It was really cool. It was cool to see Miles. And I'm sat there watching it thinking, this is really, really cool, because I love my jazz. And, you know, it was the chance to see jazz was a great. And it had this bloke, John Coltrane, I'd heard about him. I got my little Observer's Book of Jazz. And I'd read about Coltrane. It sounded really interesting. And I thought, that's like John Coltrane, isn't it? And then it comes to his saxophone solo. And to me, it was like he took that tune, which I didn't know was modal. I didn't know anything about it at all. It was just a jazz tune. But it seems like he took that tune and he grabbed it by the neck and he took the sort of central phrase that everyone was playing on. Everyone's playing here. Miles is playing here in this world, and it's like this. They're playing within the confines of this track. And then Coltrane came in and he took an aspect of it and he starts to build it out like this. And he builds it out and out and out till it gets to this like really incredible place. And he seems involved in this. And the Miles Davis Group and a few other musicians, they're having a fag in the background. And they're all sat there. Everyone who knows has watched this knows about this. They're all watching it like this. And Miles is as cool as he can. And then Coltrane plays a phrase and they sort of go like this. It's only an instant when they break their cool, but they're shocked. They're shocked. They're bust out of their coolness by what Coltrane's doing. I fell off my chair because I was interested in musicians who played fast. I was so young. That's what I was interested in. I was interested in heavy metal. And I was interested in players that played fast, but I didn't know why I was interested in players who played fast, right? It got nothing to do with the fact that they got loads of technical chops. I found it incredibly exciting, but I didn't know what it was. I'm thinking of doing a video on playing fast and why I think it's bloody brilliant, you know, on what it represents creatively and why it's a high creative expression to play fast. Which is why so many jazz musicians attempt to do it. But what I was looking for wasn't really being delivered to me by Uli John Roth or Gary Moore, whoever the guitarists I were listening to at that time. But Coltrane did it. And I think what it was receiving the energy that elevates you into the fourth dimension. That's what I wanted from music. I want to be taken to a certain place, and that's what Coltrane did. He was at number 2 on my list, so he was at number 1. It's bloody obvious, isn't it? The greatest, Charlie Parker. The Bird. Again, another musician I've spoken about on many a time. And I'm not going to explain who he is. If you've watched this video, got this point, you don't know who Charlie Parker is. He was born in 1920. He is the architect of bebop, along with Dizzy Gillespie and a few others. But the sound of bebop is based upon Charlie Parker's way of playing, which is based upon the Kansas City style with Lester Young, who was involved in, and Count Basie. And in that, they used to play this sort of fast double time approach. He started playing like that with this such a much more rapid phrasing that was different to the way the swing guys phrased. And he also had a sort of harmonic epiphany at some point when he started to play jazz standards in all 12 keys, and he started to realise he could expand on the harmony. And everyone tells his story. I think what it is, he just developed the chops to be able to fly through those changes in a way nobody else had ever been able to. And I think it was him. He just could do that. And I think it created something which musicians just were bamboozled by. And they could achieve that sound if they copied him, but they were just copying him. And in a way, it was the great damnation of jazz. It was the liberation of jazz, but the damnation of jazz. And maybe that's what I need to talk about, because Charlie Parker sits in the middle of jazz. Before then, jazz is a commercial music form. It's a popular music form. People dance to it. It sells millions and millions of records. The people are superstars that play it. You know, it produced the likes of Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby, as well as them superstars like Gene Krupa and Benny Goodman. If you got the gig with the Benny Goodman band, you became an instant star because you're on the radio all the time. But the beboppers, they pushed jazz into these small jazz clubs. They moved from being the music of the sort of marijuana smoker to the heroin addict, you know. There was a recording ban on bebop. So bebop emerged in the late 30s and 40s. But what's incredible about it, I think, which no one ever says, was it wasn't recorded. So by the time the recording ban was lifted in 1945, which is at the end of the war, you've got a whole bunch of African Americans who fought in the bloody war. They fought for freedom. They fought to fight against this bloody tyrannical, you know, totalitarian, fascistic force that was trying to take over the world. And then they returned to America, and they returned to sort of the Jim Crow and segregation. They must have thought, what the hell did I bloody do that? Why did I just put my arse on the line for this country? What did I do this for? And rather than wanting to sort of dance around and have a good time to, you know, Artie Shaw or Count Basie or Duke Ellington, they wanted a music which expressed that. And I think it was bebop. And bebop just emerges at that point, fully formed. There's no messing, it's fully formed. And I think it's Charlie Parker. This music was esoteric, it was dark, it represented an otherness, it represented a sort of nighttime way of life. It's represented drugs, it represented a whole mystique, you know, of having your own language, which obviously we've said, you know, Lester Young created, but Dizzy Gillespie was very good in channeling that towards bebop. You know, lots of hats, lots of berets, lots of strange moustaches, lots of strange walks, lots of, you know, esoteric sort of chat. Right at the centre of it is Charlie Parker. When I first heard Charlie Parker, I was like, "This is like the greatest solo stuff I've ever heard." He never goes wrong. He's never it's just totally natural to him. He just flies. He literally, you can see why it's called bird, because he just flies. There's no stopping him. It doesn't sound like he's even trying. That's the mystery of him. And nobody can copy him, but everybody tried to copy him. And the only way you could try to copy him was by becoming a clone of him. You know, and there was that tune by Charlie Mingus when he said one day, you know, I can't remember what it's called. It was something like, you know, that it's as though Charlie Parker's a gunslinger and one day he's going to go out and shoot all the people who are copying him. He's the greatest. I think he is the greatest improviser that has ever lived in jazz. Most beautiful tone, rhythmically incredible, harmonically incredible. He's untouchable in a way. And in a way, he destroyed jazz because A, he turned it into an elite art form that then the poshies would want to jump on and make their own, which they have. And B, he made every young jazz musician feel that they have to learn to play through the changes or they're no good. They're not a proper jazz musician. That is what Charlie Parker brought to jazz. So he's incredible. I was obsessed by him when I was 16 years old. I can remember when I was about 15 or 16, when my mum and dad said, "What do you want for Christmas?" I never said scale electrics like everyone else in my school. I said, "I want a Charlie Parker album," and they bought me my first Charlie Parker album. I just couldn't get enough of him. He was just so exciting as a player. I liked him and Coltrane. They were my two favourites. But Coltrane, you could tell it was like he'd worked to get there. He was like Sisyphus pushing that rock up the bloody mountain. But Charlie Parker just flew. It was as though, you know, now he did a ton of practice, and he worked at it. And there's that famous story, you know, when Joe Jones threw that cymbal at him because he wasn't very good. But why wasn't he very good? You know, was it this just classic jazz cutting thing and he realised he was no good and he walked off and realised he had to put the work in? Or was it actually that he was trying to do something at that point, but he wasn't pulling it off? Or could he have just been playing in the way that he played and got famous for, but they just weren't ready for it? Which one was it? I've never been able to work that one out. Charlie Parker. That's what we've ended up with. I hope you enjoyed this video on the 10 greatest jazz saxophone players. I am now going to do an exploration through jazz. We're going to be looking at all the instruments. I want to really talk about jazz, and I really want to talk about prog, and I really want to talk about jazz fusion, because recently I've been an idiot standing up in here, you know, gooning to the camera and going on about Cher and all that type of stuff. And although it will hurt my channel, I do want to get back to talking about real music. I'll have to throw a few in. So if you've got any suggestions of sort of, you know, that you serious viewers who are watching this now, if you've got any suggestions of sort of the worst or the most annoying or the most overrated that I could do, so I don't have to even come up with the ideas, I'll come in here and do them. There's no problem. Everybody can watch those. We know all the normal music fans that don't like jazz, they can watch those. And then you can see that I'm only doing it so that we can come in here and talk about Ornette Coleman and Wayne Shorter and Sidney Bechet and all these incredible musicians that never really get mentioned out there in the real world, do they? They just want me to talk about Bruce Springsteen. And so if you like this approach, then you've got to put some likes on it. You've got to subscribe. You've got to share. You've got to support these videos, which are not the popular videos. You know, I know this is not a popular video, but you never know. You never know. It might suddenly catch on, and suddenly people will find that this is interesting, and they go, "Oh, actually, Andy's chatting about jazz in a way," which is what I'm trying to do, which is make you go, "Oh, I actually want to listen to that." And his insight, I've got a way of approaching it now. I know where it sits in the history, and I know what the musicians are trying to do. You know, it's all about listening. It's all about you bringing yourself to these great musicians and see what they communicate to you and see if they say anything to you. And if you don't understand what they're saying to you, maybe you just got to learn a few phrases. Like when you go to France, you know, and you got your little phrase book, you know, où est la porte? Where is the door? Is that right? I'm not a linguist whatsoever. I'm English. Anyway, like this video, subscribe to it. There's loads of you not subscribed. Why aren't you subscribed? If you hate me, if you're watching me And you want to know, you want to be able to come here and hate what I do, you can subscribe. Please subscribe. Come on. Everybody subscribe now. Press it now. You can become a patron. The links are down below. You can check all my links there. There's millions of things you can check out. I'm here to entertain you. That's what I'm here to do. There's so much stuff that I can entertain you with. If you check on the links. Oh, I've got wind now. Become a patron. You can become a free member. You can go over to my Substack, read essays, listen to podcasts. There's all sorts of things that are going on. If you find stuff you like, I'll do more of it because I'm a popularist. You know, that's what I am. I'll do whatever you want, really. You know, I'm a YouTube whore. You just got to let me know what you want. But at least I tell you, the rest of them don't tell you. They pretend like they're doing something all sophisticated, don't they, bloody YouTubers? I'm going into a slight rant, you know. I think I've done too much serious talking this morning. I'm just going to get out of here. Anyway, you know all the spiel. See you later. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.